I'm so glad I am in a warm bed, and I'm thinking about all those individuals that we know quite well now who aren't.
Are we making AI God? And are we creating a God in ourselves?
Humans haven't changed. We have always been capable of great beauty and great ugliness. Humans can't save ourselves. Everything needs community. Do you know, Ashleigh, you are the first person who has ever, or that I'm hearing say, I've always been a Mary. So many women identify with the Martha.
Right.
I love people, and that is genuinely a gift. I am significantly less alive when I'm alone. I'm Zoe, and I'm here for the Nurture Your Zest podcast today.
Hi, and welcome to Nurture Your Zest. I'm your host, Ashleigh King, and I will bring you a wealth of interesting people with fascinating ideas across the tech industries, the creative industries, and also uplifting stories of courage and hope. We all go through prickly situations in life. I believe that through courage, creativity, and curiosity, you can find inspiration to nurture your zest. That thing that gets you up and out of bed every morning, the thing that lifts you up and lights up your day. So join me in the studio and let's see who we have in the hot seat today. Hello and welcome to Nurture Your Zest. Today I have the wonderful Zoe. So Zoe, it's great to have you here. As people can see, you are a woman of the cloth, I suppose we should say. I'm so happy to have you here today. I feel like we've had a few conversations and they've been such a fun dance around so many interesting topics. So I'm really happy to have you here. It's probably best if you introduce yourself. How would you like to explain Zoe?
It's great to be here. So I'm Zoe. I am, amongst other things, an ordained minister in the Church of England. So that would make me a reverend. I've been ordained about 12 years. In my current job, I work at Newcastle Cathedral. And my job it's got an unusual title, Canon for Mission, which really means translating how we live out our faith as people of faith in this city. And so I get to have interesting conversations like this. So the arts and the amazing space that we have is part of that. And many, many other parts of stuff that we've begun to talk about, like social justice issues. Those are the kinds of things that get me out of bed in the mornings anyway. And I get to do that all day in the heart of Newcastle City with the cathedral.
I think that sounds like such a fun job, but also hard and also enriching, yet challenging and provoking and confronting to people on a number of topics. So I guess I should say for people listening or viewing this particular episode, how this kind of episode came about. So I happened to go to a Northeast Chamber of Commerce cathedral event that was all about carols and connections for Christmas. And I was just so moved by it because, this episode is not specifically about the cathedral, it's about Zoe. But I think for me, it was just, I was really touched by the mission of the cathedral in wanting to include people from all walks of life, from all faiths and none. And as a person of faith myself, I was just really moved by, for me, the example of loving your neighbor that I see present and that I see missing in lots of churches at the moment. So I'm so happy to have you here. I do feel we're going to have a dance around a number of topics that are on my heart and that are really keeping me up at night. And I'm just so excited to have you. So thank you. I wanted to say, what's keeping you up at night at the moment? What kind of things do you muse on in the middle of the night?
Well, many things. At the moment, we have a lot of homeless people who come and spend their day warming up in the cathedral, and we have a project which I'm involved in, which means that we are trying to provide not just spiritual but practical support, which means working with lots of other agencies in the city and many amazing partners. But yeah, so at the moment I'm thinking I'm so glad I am in a warm bed, and I'm thinking about all those individuals that we know quite well now who aren't. So that's one of those things. Other big stuff. I mean, I am somebody who's always been really, really politically interested and quite passionate in this role. It's so important that we find ways to live out passion for justice. So for me, that's what gets me out of bed. I didn't grow up in the church, so for me, God was initially a sense of a feeling, and we should definitely have some of that conversation because we started it. As you said, we've danced around. But for me, the how do we live out those values as a person who is committed to being the best I can be, but also who's made a really tangible commitment, which is what becoming a Christian in my case is, to live out those values. And I mean that in how I am as a mum, a wife, a sibling, a neighbour, a friend, but also a member of a community. And we know how much structural injustice there is, the flipping, shifting powers at the moment, and the big stuff going on that's on our minds, climate change, all of that stuff is huge. And it also feels like something that is part of the day job. So yeah, the big things really, especially as a mum who, has got 3 young adults who are setting out into the world, and things have changed and are changing. So looking at how we carry ourselves with authenticity and integrity, and it's a complex world, isn't it?
It sure is. There's a lot of wicked problems out there. There is the refugee crisis, there is wars, we have trans inclusion and all kinds of polarization. And this is something that really worries me actually for our world. And what worries me mainly is how quickly we can access information and how much of it's AI generated that maybe hasn't been fact checked.
Yeah.
I think there are times, especially in business, I find it so helpful as an ADHD person to help me to check my tone, because I can be more impulsive, or I cannot understand how certain things might be taken or inferred in a message. So that's really helpful. And it helps break down big complex emails or grant funding, or it helps me to learn. But at the same time, there are times where I've thought, if we talked to God or Jesus or creator or universe or faith source, whatever you want to call it, I guess are we making AI God? And are we creating a God in ourselves? Do you know what I mean? And this is something that I'm really exploring and I'm worried about.
Yeah, well, and it taps into the really big questions all along, particularly that kind of bigger inner voice that quite often we have tuned out. I mean, that can be conscience even, but increasingly people are given so many opportunities to really follow a thread that you lose that broader perspective. But that's always been a bit of an issue, though. And I think one of the things that is really helpful, and it's not because I didn't grow up in the church or religion, I rejected it a lot for a long time, the role of tradition and history. But one of the things that helps me sleep is when I join in with Evensong at night, it is literally the same service that is sung in the old language from the 1600s. And for ages I was, how is this relevant? How does it connect? And the more I've kind of just inhabited, it becomes a bit of a route to humans haven't changed. We have always been capable of great beauty and great ugliness. We have always been those creatures that can be drawn into healthier or not healthy things. As a person of faith, the big story for me hasn't changed. And actually, when we zoom out, I'm a big fan of zooming out rather than zooming in on the detail, which isn't always helpful because, like you, I have ADHD and use AI, so I'm learning to do this stuff too. The zooming out from that stuff and saying, okay, what's the big story here? Humans can't save ourselves. Everything needs community. I'm pretty obsessed with small is beautiful, which is why a lot of my work in response to this stuff is around interactions with different kinds of people so that we're not colluding with our own desire to be right. Because the big story is that humans are always going to get it at least a little bit wrong. And community is the only safe thing for that. And for me, that community involves God. Christians believe that God in themselves is a community. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. It's sometimes described as a dance. And that's a relationship. And joining in with that relationship is part of my having this conversation with you today, because we need to be able to step back from ourselves, recognize that we're going to get it wrong, and also not be afraid to hear perspectives that give us more context. And I think I share your fears about context is being curated, removed, deliberately manipulated, and that's very real. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist. We know what the large language models are. We know that they have racist bias. We know that disabled people and women, and non-white people and queer people and are not the people who are creating these. So, but we can't abdicate responsibility for, well, what kind of questions do we ask of AI? And are they the bigger questions that actually we should be asking of each other too? So I know it's a phrase, check your sources, and that's getting harder and harder, isn't it? But that's true in the big story of faith and humans, and in fact, cosmology. You know, we're part of such a vast story that weirdly, when I'm in that evensong tradition of the Anglican Church, which has always believed that you only find truth through 3 legs of the same stool. I don't know whether you know this yet. I don't know whether you're Anglican or not, but we say tradition, scripture, and reason. And if you've only got 2 or 1 of those, you haven't checked enough sources.
Right.
Because we can just decide, oh, God just told me something and I'll just go and do that. And because there's too much noise out there and I don't know who to trust, I'm just not going to listen to anyone else. I'm just going to look for confirmation bias answers. Scripture, tradition, reason. And be self-aware enough and humble enough to know that we are definitely a bit wrong, especially when we're certain. I think that, for me, is how we survive this and how we create a healthier relationship with AI. Because in the end, we're the ones putting stuff in there now. It's out there. And how we communicate with that is a responsibility for us. A friend who was part of a project to be polite with Alexa, and to say please and thank you and that sort of stuff, and how that changed your answers really quite quickly. And so, yeah, I still think that we have always needed to check our sources, and that this is just a very accelerated and new and dangerous thing. But that our job, particularly my job, and part of the reason why we're talking about stuff, is to be helping people with those questions that keep them awake at night, to come to the answers, which are, I don't know, what do you think?
I think that's fascinating, because what you're saying there as well, you're also talking about having different opinions and different groups come together. And I know that's so important to you, and it's so important to me.
Yep.
And I'll never forget, I had a mentor and she floored me with this statement, because I talked about how I, at that time, was an event manager, and my whole passion was about creating events that were inclusive for everybody. And I still have this written by my desk on one of my vision boards, but it's, do the people you bring together actually want to be together? And so in my head, I decided that I wanted to bring different faith groups together with different people from different race groups. And really what I had to learn, especially as someone who is a ancestor of colonial history in South Africa and Rhodesia, Zimbabwe now, I have this guilt over apartheid. So I've done a lot of work in race relations and social justice. And I think one of the things I've always done is try to bring people together, but not always understood that there is nuance in everything. Just like even in Christianity or Sikhism or Judaism or Hinduism, there are many cultural groups and racial groups and extra nuance that we haven't explored or don't fully understand. And sometimes bringing people together isn't the right thing. But I think also giving people opportunities to have their voice heard, to have their story heard, to listen more, creating listening spaces where we can explore topics is really important. And that confirmation bias, the living in silos where you just learn one point of view, is really dangerous. So I love what you're saying about bringing people together, but getting evidence. I also like what you're saying about, well, God told me this. I think sometimes that does happen in religious spaces.
Definitely.
You might have heard of intuition or something like that. Now, I think intuition's a very powerful thing, because I actually feel that many women are naturally intuitive. I know I'm a very, very intuitive person. I often will pick up on things walking into a room, or I'll know something's not right, but I'll just tell myself, oh, you just have a particular point of view in your mind, give someone time. And then always the intuition is proved to me. So what I've wondered as well is that intuitive part that maybe many women suppress. I wonder as well if that links back to when we were burnt on the stake, I do wonder if maybe the two of us, if we were going back to the 1600s, would be burned at the stake, or would be seen as mavericks or witches, or kind of to use your platform or to use your voice to empower others and to speak up for others is a very brave thing to do. So I would love to hear your thoughts on intuition and just being different. And you're probably the most different kind of preacher that I've ever come across, which is why I had to have this chat with you. And I would love to hear your thoughts.
I've got loads of friends to introduce you to, because there's plenty of people.
Yeah, but yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on intuition, but also this kind of sense of being a female leader in a church and in a faith, and what that looks like.
Yeah, it's I've got lots of friends. I mean, most of my friends wouldn't call themselves practicing Christians or are of other faiths. But again and again, my friends and I have often laughed and said, gosh, we'd have been burnt at the stake for this. Because I think that, and I'm a mother of daughters, and it's kind of through seeing them grow up that they have challenged some of the things that I had not even realized about myself, such as so powerfully suppressing your intuition. And it's incredibly freeing to start going, trust your instinct. Instinct is so base, it's in there. We sometimes forget, and I do think that the Christian tradition and colonialism has a lot to answer for, but humans are a special part of creation. Are we? That is not a theology I hold. We are one part of a very small part of this cosmos, but that God is present and can speak through and in so much. But that sense of not making gods of ourselves, which we really easily do, but somehow women have really, really absorbed those messages about humility and faith and spirituality in a way which we know has been intentionally created by the patriarchy, and particularly using religion to do that. And that's still an issue. There's a Bible reading that is quoting a letter of one man to a group of people. When we're reading some of the New Testament, Paul's letters, we read that as though it's from God's mouth to our ears. The Bible is full of different genres of writing, from poetry to myth to oral history stories to convey meaning, to narrative accounts and perspectives, and then collections of letters from one person who had a very specific cultural contextual setting to a bunch of other people that we don't know much about. So we absolutely can't read our holy text that way. So we should always be very suspicious if somebody is telling us that we should, because that's just bad scholarship, actually. But I do think that some of those texts, and they are often called toxic texts, and we're quite comfortable with that language, as many of us are actually, not just women. But it's really important that we name and call that stuff out. So my boss, the dean actually, will often reference scriptures and say, I just need to be clear that this text has been used to keep women in abusive relationships and should never do that. And none of us believe that women should stay, or men, in relationships that are not psychologically as well as physically safe. And so that is a challenge to the received tradition, but it's where reason and instinct and intuition and people's stories, it's almost impossible to stick with a siloed bit of truth. We believe this, Christians believe this. If you then sit in front of somebody who's demonstrably experienced something different, well, am I saying that God is less present in them? No, I'm trying to just keep my own hard edges for my own psychological comfort because that works for me. Well, that is kind of the opposite of what Jesus did. I mean, Jesus was absolutely outrageously bold in crossing boundaries socially, especially with women. And those instincts where there was that real embodied, I mean, the woman who came and poured away the most expensive thing you could own, on his feet, which she shouldn't have been in the room, let alone physically touching him. It was utterly haram for her to be touching him with her hair. And he grew up in that context, so he knew exactly how outrageous it was, and modelled, hey, something in her is teaching us something. Tune in. Well, that hasn't changed, but it is hard when what we're being asked to receive doesn't match my experience. And that's always an issue around inclusion. When we talk about inclusivity, well, for who and who decides? Sometimes things are potentially mutually exclusive, which is where I think, for me, curiosity is the most useful thing that we can have. And I'm really committed to nurturing curiosity in myself and having those curious conversations, the kind of which we're starting here. But it is so, so important that we don't curate someone else's experience.
That's so important what you've just said there. It's so important for us not to curate someone's experience. So other people have other perspectives. They have a model of the world. They have their own beliefs, their own values, their own perspectives, their own filters they see the world through. So how can we just tell people how to be, who to be? I think one of the things you were talking about there is when you talk about Jesus as like the ultimate rebel, he actually is, because if you think about this kind of, one of the things I always see is what a listener, and he held space for people, and he went to the people that were the most undesirable. He helped Lazarus and lepers, and he interacted with people from many different groups in a time where you're talking about he knew exactly what the social stigma was around certain groups. Yeah. But he held space for people. He listened. I'll never forget the story of Martha and Mary, actually. So, and I wanted to ask you about that because I've always been a Mary. So I've always been the person who wants to sit and listen and give my time and attention and presence and engage and ask and learn. And I've never really been the organized, perfect, tidy house. But both of those skills are so important. And especially if we think about in the church, but also in wider organizations and wider politics or government organizations, we all have different things that we can contribute. And one of the things I love is learning about our gifts. And in the church, you do learn about that. You learn everyone has a different role to contribute. And I know mine can be encouraging and it can be all these things, but actually acts of service or loving other people. But I've just never been gifted with those organizational parts.
Fascinating. Yeah. Do you know, Ashleigh, you are the first person who has ever, or that I'm hearing say, I've always been a Mary. So many women identify with the Martha.
Right.
That there's an element of almost martyrdom in that, isn't there? Going, because, we have to do it all, don't we? And if you grow up and that's not natural to you, and actually, and I think this is where ADHD is a bit of a gift, the thing in front of us, or for me, my experience of ADHD is it's the only thing that matters in that moment. So those connections, it's almost like the rest of the world stops existing, which can be really annoying and difficult for the people who are the ones keeping the plates spinning. But the Mary gift is usually devalued, and there's quite a lot of shaming associated with, never mind if the washing up's not finished, I'm going to sit down because this feels like an important moment. And I think there's something about that women talk about increasingly, certainly in parenting, actually. That honestly, if when kids want to talk to you about something, it isn't going to be when you sit them down because it's convenient. You've got to be kind of ready to just stop and hear what's being said and be there in that moment. And so much of this job is about that, actually. And it is definitely a gift. And that sense of, not everybody has the same gift. It's really, really, really important, which kind of brings me back to the stuff I was saying about no one person has it all. So we need everybody's bits thriving in the space. And we need to recognize that my bit doesn't thrive unless yours does. And that's where I think inclusion and, the whole, for me, the theology of the body of Christ, but actually it's much bigger. It's back to that cosmology stuff. It translates in the tiny bit in a relationship of two people or a family. We need to make it okay for everybody to be themselves, but we also need everybody bringing their gifts to the table, and their gifts being able to be honoured in order to be put to work, because actually life's full of compromise. So needing other people's opinions, needing that reason, tradition, scripture, or curiosity about what am I not seeing in this moment, and all of that stuff, that it's all about community, which for me brings me back to that big community of who we might feel we're connecting to as people of faith, or in our spiritual practice, or the wider sense of those things which we can't see. I think it's that zooming in and zooming out again in practice. But I think women so often have been taught, doesn't matter how you feel, get on with what needs to be done. This is how the world works. And that is how it is still most of the time. And it's a real challenge to shift the needle on those things. But I do think presence and listening and allowing that curious conversation is usually the space where the change is possible.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because funnily, talking about that has actually brought up quite a lot of emotion for me, because I think I'm working through quite a lot in my personal life. I've become a mother at the end of 2023, and it's shifted my entire identity of myself, but especially in terms of trying to manage a household and manage a small business and bring a little human up. And in terms of my views around marriage and just my views of how I am. And I've actually written a poem called Burnt Cookies. Ooh. But it's all about, like, I wish I could be the mum who has the perfect, cookies, but I'm just not that person. And it's really interesting also when you bring in neurodiversity into that as well. What I did want to ask you about is, you've mentioned about women, and you've also mentioned about disability.
Yeah.
So you have your walking stick with you, but I'm just curious as well, if we think of that concept of, there are these expectations of, you have to do this step, you have to do that step. What about when life throws you a challenge or a curveball you weren't expecting?
Yeah.
Could you tell us a bit about your disability, but also how that affects maybe somebody who is a person of faith, has a disability, and their maybe perspective of themselves? Because I know just from having a child and just the impact on my time and my ability to show up in the way I want to, how much it impacts me. So when you then throw in other medical issues or other different types of labels we might get, I'm just curious about what that might mean.
Yeah, well, it's really fascinating, because I think there's, for context, what I've identified is that when people share the story about how they understand who they are and how they relate to their own disabilities or limitations, whatever they might be, if you are born with yours, you carry that differently to if you acquire it. And for me, what that showed, so I became disabled when I had a pregnancy complication that left me with a great deal of internal scar tissue. So mine's a chronic pain issue. And it was absolutely out of the question that I could not get better, because women can't sit down. Mums have got to do it all. And oh my goodness. So the only option was to push through, ignore my body, and the pressure that put on everything. I'd got 3 kids under 5 at this point, wow, and a husband running a business, and was like, okay, I literally don't think this is actually possible. What do you prioritize? How does that work? What does that mean in terms of God? Why aren't you making me better? You've given me these 3 miracles. You've given, I've got this calling that I'm now following to be a public one of those. And I can't do the school run. So what's the point of me? And that was a really, really big moment, actually. And that sort of, well, you can only do the other stuff if you're keeping all the other show on the road. We only get to have a life if you've done everyone else's, if you've created everyone else's. And that's huge. And a lot of women feel that, disability or not. But that sense of, right, okay, so I was trying every possible thing I could, because, I'm a problem solver, or try to approach a problem and that way, as a lot of people do. And it was too big. And I think there's a real danger, and I'm going to say it, sometimes your inspirational podcasts can sometimes simplify the self-help stuff, because actually, what if we've tried all of that and I still can't walk my kids to school? What then? There's no supplement that's going to fix this. They are still there. I have still got to do what I need to do, but I actually can't. So I ran into myself in that and was like, now what? Weirdly, the transition for me and the enormous journey that I've been on in terms of understanding how faith, spirituality, and a disabled and limited body connect. And it's been a really pivotal, important part of who I am and how I do this work. That feels like a gift. My limitations, I now fully understand to be a gift, even if it was one I don't want. It absolutely is a gift. And I'm not being trite. And I would never say that of somebody else, because pain is not a gift that you would ever give to anybody. And it's a pain condition. The big transition for me was being recommended for this job, which is a full-time training, full-time, very demanding. I'd only ever seen people doing this stuff on legs in a very business-like way, on top of all of the admin, all that. I'd only ever seen that, because that's usually what we project onto people who are wearing a uniform. We've all got lives behind the scenes, let's be honest. But the gift that I had, and that because I had no choice, there was a moment of, well, what if you turn towards the pain? And it was somebody who was teaching me mindfulness, actually, and the body scan thing as part of being at Vicar School. He's a deeply spiritual person who's a priest, who said, you might want to punch me in the face, Zoe, but I'm just going to risk saying it to you. What if you turn towards the pain? Because everything up to that point, the culture I grew up in, women don't sit down, all that other stuff. Well, I've got to get better because God has called me to do this. And, I need to do the school run as well, and blah, 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 all that. What if I turn towards the pain? And it began with mindfulness for me. And that was it was anathema, shocking, appalling. But also the thing that changed my life. So stopping, daring to see what my body was saying to me. We're back to feelings and intuition and sense, and the fact that we are more than our day job or whatever hat we're wearing. Turning towards it as a gift because of its limitations, recognizing what it's saying and seeing, and how does that fit with the whole of me? And somebody described it to me. One of the ways that my body is doing things is that it's like the burglar alarm's going off and I'm not being burgled anymore. So my body is screaming, is saying something. What makes a difference? How are you nurturing your pain? And for me, that was, well, I've just got to sit down. And I didn't, and my initial reaction was, well, sitting down, it doesn't work. I sat down for 3 days and it didn't work. It took about 3 months and it was awful, but I actually had no choice. That's when I made the transition into being a wheelchair user, because there was an expectation that I had been sincerely called to this ministry, that because I loved God and I'd made a commitment to, okay, ask whatever you want of me and I will do it. Well, that meant getting in a wheelchair in order to go to lectures. And I did not want to be seen in that way. I did not want to, wheelchairs are iconic, aren't they? You immediately become a person of pity and absolutely a person of weakness. People relate to you so differently. And it's always hard, but it is fascinating. So I started being curious about, what is it doing to me? What is it showing other people? It's showing that we are all limited, and that actually to embrace our limitations is how we find healing. Because right back to what I've kept on saying, we are not solitary creatures, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Humans only thrive as part of an ecosystem which recognizes that there is a symbiotic relationship. Theology teaches us the same. Jesus lived it out in every way, and I had no choice but to sit with it in myself and go, my limitations somehow, which are public as can be, putting a wheelchair and a dog collar into the same space, I mean, it is kind of the core of my ministry. And without me doing or saying anything at all, but showing up as a vulnerable leader that looks different, no one projects onto me that I can do it all because they can see I can't. But in reality, nor can anyone else. So our limitations are a gift if we are willing to be owning them in a new way, but also allowing other people to own theirs. So if it becomes all about me, I can't do this, I need that. And there is a lot of that as sort of which feels like overcorrection.
Yeah, there's almost a word that's sometimes used in some of the kind of more American right-wing kind of podcasts. It can be almost like there's this victimization culture or something like that. But sometimes it's true. Not always, but it can be, this is my label. It's my label. It belongs to me. And there's this over-identifying with a label. And I've noticed that too. In myself, sometimes I have to go, how can I put this down? Or how can I be a version of myself that is vulnerable and needs help? What you're saying as a wheelchair user and as a disabled person is so interesting to me because, you know, when I sit and think about it, I don't think I've ever met anybody in the clergy or that I've seen in a leadership position that is vulnerable in that way.
Nor did I.
And this is the thing. So it is a gift in a sense of, imagine the impact of seeing somebody in the representation of wow. I don't know. I'm not fully articulate.
It does. It tells a story, and I'm for so long wished it wasn't my body telling it. But actually, what helps me live with that is, well, it's telling the same story that we all need to own. Because actually, back to Mary and Martha, Jesus's answer was, "It's all right to just let it drop for a bit, Martha."
Yeah, exactly. That was it. That was
it's
the
all
thing.
Right.
Is
we're all still going to get fed, but everybody else is going to have to put themselves out a bit.
Yeah,
and we all have to be basically willing to be as getting comfortable with our limitations as we are with other people's, and going, fine, I can help you out with that bit. Are you all right to help me with this bit?
Mm-hmm.
And for whatever reason, that is not mainstream culture, but I do think generally women are better at it because we've lived in community from the start, and also we've not had power. So when you don't have power, you organise to get stuff done because you know you need more than you. But that's a gift, isn't it? But I do think when we start wielding our diagnoses, it can very easily become weaponizing. I need this, therefore you're not as important. And I passionately believe that can't be true. So for me, if something's good news, and we talk about that, you know, so for my filter, anytime I'm saying anything about God or Jesus or life, if it doesn't apply to everybody, it doesn't apply to me. So if I'm saying it's great that I can just sit down and I know most people can't do it. So what are the conditions? What is it that makes that not okay? And so how is what I'm saying not just alienating then? Which is why I think I resist the inspirational trauma porny stuff, because it's like, okay, well, your story's fine, but my story is still also intact. And actually, we've all got to be doing this for this to work. And we're not all doing it. And that's a problem. And that's what that's what gets me out of bed in the morning, building that kind of community.
It's so interesting as well what you said about the inspirational kind of trauma porn, because I do see this. I do have a learning difficulty with ADHD, but what I found is when I got diagnosed, all of a sudden I had all these offers to comment or speak on particular neurodiversity days or things like this. And it was very flattering and great. At the same time, it was like, well, to speak on behalf of a whole bunch of people who have their own needs and views. And what I'd love to ask you about is, and I know we've also talked about this offline, but you know, you wearing your collar now. What about when you just want to be Zoe? You know, and you're actually, your social battery is limited and you want to protect your personal space and your family. You know, what about when you're just Zoe in the supermarket?
Yeah, I use a scarf a lot. And these come out.
Oh, great. Ah, fab. That's
So
really cool.
I wear the version of these. I'm going to leave it off if that's all right with you.
Please do. However you want to be. You are welcome.
So and then again, women have brought this into the uniform because so much of the tailoring and all of the clergy gear was designed for men.
Of course, yeah.
They were predominantly shirts that you tuck into smart trousers. Well, women don't generally wear that stuff. So it's taken a while, but there are loads of really good producers of women's clothes.
Oh, yes.
Or we're quite good at adapting and making our own, doing mending. So just taking a t-shirt or a little cheapy kind of tops with the high collar from any cheap shop, charity shop, and making a collar insert for that and then wearing your normal clothes over it is really important to a lot of women clergy, actually. And how we wear the uniform is often really different to how men do. And that's fascinating. And there's all sorts of really interesting nuance in that stuff. But it's a really important part of me, and I'm going to say growing back into myself, because initially I just absorbed all of that anxiety. I already come with a lot of difference, so I'm already a problem because I can't do things in the way that people have always had it done. You know, you don't normally have the vicar sitting down to conduct a funeral. You don't normally have somebody sitting behind an altar when they're doing Holy Communion. And we have to make a new altar on the low bit of the church. I mean, there's a huge changes, which churches aren't always very comfortable with, but remarkably, because I come in as me and say, I don't know how to solve this. Can you help me figure this out? So from a position of actual vulnerability, I get then, I can see what you mean. We'll make those changes. And suddenly things are possible, which wouldn't have been. And so the uniform for me, the collar comes in and out. So I wear things that make me feel like me. It took a long time before I was like, hey, I used to wear makeup before. I like makeup. Why should God called me to be me, not to try and act like a blander or less Zoe version? And that's something, I'm not going to lie, I wrestle with every day, because we are part of that bigger story and tradition. So we also have to hold that. So, you know, I only, in the same way as you've just said, I can't speak for all people with ADHD. I don't represent the whole church. I certainly don't represent all women clergy. I definitely don't represent all wheelchair users. I'm married to a vicar, so I'm a vicar's wife as well.
Oh, wow. That comes with its own whole
I really don't represent them very well. And there's nothing I can do about that. But I do think we need to really own it and say, and I've done a lot of speaking and teaching around disability, because my previous job was doing a lot of that work locally and nationally, and helping churches to get their head around this stuff. And people would expect me to be the expert, the oracle on all kinds of disabilities that I have never experienced. So I absolutely discovered for myself what it feels like for someone else to be talking about what might make a solution for you. My work is making space for other people to then come and say, so from my perspective, this means this. And I absolutely live for that stuff, finding ways, and that's what we get to do at a cathedral, actually, and that's the best bit about my job, and that's the best bit about being able to have these conversations publicly. It's about, okay, well, it's really safe to hear someone else's perspective if you're curious enough to tune in and know that your experience of ADHD is just your experience of ADHD. It's not mine. But if I'm interested enough to hear about yours, you might teach me something more about mine. And the same would be true with somebody who was visually impaired or had a hearing impairment. Mine's mobility, but it's not universally the same mobility as someone else who's in a wheelchair. Some people can get out and some people can't. I can. And that is also very uncomfortable for people when you get out of your wheelchair. I occasionally make the joke, hallelujah, I've been healed, just to deal with, there's a bit of humour involved sometimes. But we are all in danger all the time of having projected onto us identities that mean that you're not like me, you're something else. And in truth, we're all a right mixture, aren't we? But we should never presume to know what someone else is experiencing. Instead, what about we try and find out? So disabilities are really, really clear, and neurodiversity is one of those, and it can feel a little bit top trumps, can't it, at the moment?
Yeah, exactly. I've got this and I've got, and it's exactly that idea of we all have things, we're working through it, but it also is true that equity is important. And for some people, we do need to make adjustments and allowances and actually bring that starting line to a much more fair point.
Absolutely.
So I think, there's a lot to learn there.
And it's not in people's interest. So you can see why it's in the interest of those who need that. And you can see why it's not in the interest of people who don't to do it. Because actually it's working for them. And what we are doing is actually making things less accessible for some. And I do think it's really important. Part of the journey is to help those who don't have that experience, and that's all of us in particular ways, isn't it? To recognise that it is good for us. It is genuinely, if you do make better quality decisions, if you have a range of experiences around the table. I don't know if we teach that enough, and that's, back to what keeps us awake at night. We are so validating of very siloed perspectives that there is no shared narrative, and lack of shared narrative is the most dangerous thing. So looking at that, I don't know you, you don't me. I'm curious about you as a starting point. I think helps us with all of this stuff. But there isn't going to be I need things to be perfectly done for me. There isn't a version of that doesn't make things harder for other people. And actually that's not good for any of us.
Absolutely. Yeah, gosh, so much learning there. I could talk to you all day, and we don't have the time to do as many dances as I want around these topics. But honestly, that conversation is going to sit with me for a while. I'm going to muse on it, I think. I really appreciate that exploration of Mary and Martha, because I think it also helps me to understand why I struggle so much with the very fast, even though I have ADHD and you would expect that to be very fast, which it can be at times. It's that, fast, decisive delivery. I just am not that person, but I also don't want to be that. It doesn't light me up. So there's a lot for me to think about. I think one thing I wanted to comment on very briefly is I love that you hold listening spaces for people and bring people in with a space of curiosity. I think it's so important whenever we're working in any social justice work, and I've learned this as an important lesson myself, to go and learn about those issues. There's so much work and emotional labor that goes into representing groups or advocating or being an activist for others. And actually, as humans, we need to learn about the different types of people and then the different journeys they're navigating. And I think, there's books I've read that have really stuck with me, that have shifted my perspective radically around privilege and stuff like this. And, I didn't realize I was a racist until I read, I'll no longer talk to white people about race. That was such a pivotal book for me. It floored me, some of the innate beliefs that I had, and it shifted my worldview. And I'm in a journey now where I want to learn more about disability, about trans inclusion, about all these different topics to understand more. But it's also about saying, because I think a lot of people are afraid to learn, a lot of people are afraid to ask. And it's also about reviewing the ideas you have in your mind. And so listening is so important. So thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure. But I think this is where it's a gift to be able to come and have a conversation that other people can listen in on it. And I think this is where podcasts are useful, because it's not threatening to hear other people talking curiously to each other. And I think that's really, really important, because it is threatening to have something that you don't even know you've had as ingrained in you, and experiencing, well, what if that's not right? That inevitably makes people scared, and people don't make good decisions and don't connect well when they're afraid. And that's what we are, the best version of ourselves, when we seek to break down the fear of hearing something different and just allowing that to sit and going, oh, actually, that's interesting, rather than, that's got to be wrong because it challenges me. And that's why I'm grateful that we can have conversations like these, that, we're not asking anyone to agree with me or you or anybody else. Actually, it's a sense of I just want to know more about your story, Ashleigh. And I think that's a really brilliant starting point to not only platforming and seeing the world from one perspective, because we need the lot.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So I need to ask you my favourite question. So what is your number one word to nurture your zest? So what gets you out of bed in the morning? What brings you life? What helps you when you're feeling in darkness? What gives you joy?
I love people, and that is genuinely a gift. I am significantly less alive when I'm alone. There's something deeply relational about my DNA. So no matter what kind of day I'm having, if someone else comes into the room, I become more me. So that's in a very practical way, in that my lovely husband brings me coffee. But also I know that my day is going to be full of those things, even though that's really hard as well. Hell is, of course, still other people.
Yeah.
But yeah, my zest is nurtured by being around other people and actually being able to have conversations and go, and follow a thread in a different way.
I love that. Thank you so much. And thank you for coming on, and thank you for this dance through lots of topics.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to Nurture Your Zest today. If you're feeling extra kind, it would mean so much to me if you could share this episode with your friends or family, or anyone who you think might feel inspired by this content. Liking, sharing, or interacting with our content is a great way to support us as content creators, and it helps us to bring interesting stories and more people to you. This podcast is a Flamingo Heights podcast studio production, and I've been your host, Ashleigh King. If you liked today's episode, follow the video on your screen now, or check out the link in your show notes to find similar content.